Hello everybody and welcome back to the HLTCO YouTube channel. Today's video concerns Michael Olise and the release clause of £35 million that was triggered yesterday afternoon/evening by Chelsea. The fee itself is obviously looked upon as something of a drop in the ocean from neutral perspectives and partisan ones alike. I think every Chelsea fan across the world is probably celebrating at the fact they are getting a player in Michael Olise who has such a high ceiling for such a low fee. But the reason for this video, I suppose, from a Crystal Palace perspective, is to try and shed some light on exactly how that deal has come to be and why we are losing such a highly talented player for such a low sum. The entire narrative, I suppose, around Michael Olise is one which I suppose is a Marmite one. You know, you can look towards his celebrations, for example. Following goals, he scored one particular free kick last season in the last couple of minutes against Manchester United at Selhurst Park. He didn't celebrate, and it was this moment of bafflement for many neutrals because they couldn't understand why he as an individual wasn't over the moon to have scored. And it's sort of a theme which has run through his entire Premier League stay so far whenever the spotlight has been shone on him. But I think you can look towards these release clauses, both in terms of the deal that has been struck by Chelsea to take him away from Crystal Palace and the specific deal that saw us take him from Reading in the first place, and see that this is an individual who truly does back himself to succeed at every single level. You know, when he first moved to Crystal Palace from Reading, it was a day or two after Patrick Vieira had arrived as manager, and the transfer itself came completely out of the blue. I'm sure you, like me, are well aware that in the modern game you often hear about transfers a week or two at least before they are officially signed and sealed, but this particular deal came about very, very quickly. An announcement was made probably 48 hours after we found out that Patrick Vieira was taking charge, and the fee itself of £8 million paid to the Royals felt like a genuine drop in the ocean. And the reason for that fee was that Michael Olise had negotiated it with Reading prior to putting pen to paper on that particular contract, because he fully backed himself to perform at the level necessary to be a success for them and earn a move to the Premier League, and that's exactly what he did, joining Crystal Palace under Patrick Vieira to be part of that project. Of course, in the intervening period, he has played pretty regularly for us. Patrick Vieira has now departed the football club and Roy Hodgson has come back on a one-year contract to take charge of us across the 23-24 season. But the suggestion was, until a couple of weeks ago, that Michael Olise would remain on our books for the entirety of the 23-24 campaign before almost certainly moving on at the end of this season. He, of course, has the injury that he picked up across the summer, which will see him out until at least the end of September, if not the first couple of weeks of October. And of course, there is a degree of conjecture over whether or not he will be the same player immediately when he returns to full fitness. But Chelsea are seemingly happy to take that gamble, and at £35 million as a release clause, who can really blame them? There has been a fair bit of frustration and pushback from Palace fans about the fact that we are allowing a player of Michael Olise's ability and high ceiling to leave the football club for a fee which is perceived to be genuinely small. But I think you have to, or at least I have tried in the last sort of 12 to 18 hours to zoom out a little bit and look at the specific mechanics around this, because it's quite clear to me that Michael Olise would not have signed a contract with Crystal Palace were a release clause not to be active as part of the deal. You know, we have seen it with Reading. It's the only reason he came to Crystal Palace in the first place and why we got him at such a reasonable sum. And I'm not suggesting it had to be £35 million. It may have been able to be pushed up to, say, 40, 45 at the point of entry. But I do not believe, there is no part of me that believes that he would have signed for Crystal Palace with no release clause in there at all. You know, it's obviously a very emotional subject for many Crystal Palace fans, but as I said to somebody last night, this is a football club under the guidance of our current owners who have extracted genuine value out of transfers that have been a high profile nature in years gone by. We managed to get £30 million plus from Everton for Yannick Bolasie. We managed to get £50 million from Manchester United for Aaron Wan-Bissaka. And this isn't me trying to diminish Aaron Wan-Bissaka's quality and potential at the time of that sale, but I think it's fair to say that Michael Olise has a far higher ceiling. So there is no part of me that believes Crystal Palace are happy to be allowing Michael Olise to leave for just £35 million. But the alternative to having this release clause as part of the contract that Michael Olise signed at Selhurst Park would be to not have had him at all. And I think it's fair to say that the 2 years of service we have had from Michael and the profit we have been able to generate from his sale has to be looked upon as a necessary evil. I don't think any part of Steve Parish or the Crystal Palace hierarchy will be happy about this, particularly in a summer when Wilfried Zaha has of course also departed, moving to Galatasaray to chase that Champions League dream. And it does throw a significant spanner in the works for us, because it leaves Abir Eze really as the only true creative force and attacking thrust in that attacking midfield role for us. We've got Matthias França, who has come in, but he is still very raw, he is young, he is in a new culture, a new league, a new language, and it will take him time to get up to speed, particularly when you consider the way that Roy Hodgson works and what he is likely to want from him in the long run. But it does also mean that we can move slightly differently in the transfer market between now and the deadline at the start of September, and that is something that I think every Crystal Palace fan quite rightly will now demand of the board going into this next couple of weeks. Because if you look at the transfer business that we have had available to us prior to Michael Olise's departure, there have been names like Callum Hudson-Odoi, Damari Gray. I think we will now, and this is no disrespect to either of those two, but we will now potentially be shopping in a higher level. And with that in mind, the Michael Olise sale, whilst not perfect, it does give us the fluidity to be able to set our sights slightly higher. There was an available budget prior to Michael Olise's departure, but I think the reason that we have hedged our bets somewhat across the last couple of weeks and not made those concrete moves for the players I've just mentioned is because we were well aware that this situation may well come to a head. And if you look at Chelsea's overall spending across this summer window, it is mind-boggling. I've said already on the General Football podcast that I recorded this morning over on Patreon that their spending for this week alone is set to top £200 million. It is quite head-spinning in terms of the numbers we are talking about. But in terms of Michael Olise's transfer specifically, you are looking at a mere drop in the ocean given his potential, even with this issue that he's picked up over the summer, which may well set him back quite a fair way in terms of his progression as a footballer. I don't necessarily think, and this is me talking as neutrally as possible. I'm trying not to have any sour grapes over this. It's part of the business of football, but I do genuinely believe he may well stunt his progress in the immediate future by joining Chelsea, because by definition he isn't going to play as regularly once he is back to full fitness as he would have done were he still at Crystal Palace. And I think that was probably one of the key aspects to what Crystal Palace were trying to do in selling him on staying for the entirety of this season, because there is no doubt in my mind, in terms of his overall ability, Michael Olise is a fantastic footballer, but there are still edges to be knocked off him. He is far from the finished article, and I think another full campaign under Roy Hodgson at Crystal Palace would have probably been preferable for his development as a footballer than joining Chelsea at this stage. But it's the call that he has made. I mean, I am not aware of any of the specific contractual minute details that have been put in by Michael Olise and his representatives over this deal with Chelsea, but the way he has handled himself throughout his career to date, I wouldn't be surprised at all if he does insert some sort of release clause in there for the likes of Real Madrid or Barcelona to activate in the next 2 or 3 years. It's just the way that Michael goes about things, and you can call it high risk. There are plenty of people saying to me on social media yesterday, it's a bit of a bold call from him to insist on a release clause of £35 million at Crystal Palace, but he's fully backed himself and he's got his moves, so I suppose you can say in the fullness of time he's done what he set out to do, and really from a Crystal Palace perspective, it's just about us now spending the money appropriately between this date, the 16th of August, and the end of the summer window at the start of September. I am not someone that expects or demands my football club to go out and spend mad sums of money, but I think Roy Hodgson quite rightly said when we were out on the US section of our pre-season campaign that we needed fresh bodies in. Of course, Wilfried Zaha leaving leaves a huge gap in terms of our playing style and the overall feel of the group. You throw Michael Olise into that and the matter becomes even more pressing. So I would fully expect Crystal Palace to spend upwards of £40 million between now and the end of the summer transfer window. When you consider the budget that was already available to us for transfers, when you consider the £41.6 million that we had earmarked to go to Wilfried Zaha on that 4-year contract prior to him moving to Galatasaray, and with this £35 million release clause that has now been activated by Chelsea for Michael Olise's signature. And you know, I've said this on the Palace podcast this morning, and I will repeat it on this video now. For my money, as much as you can look towards a release clause as a very basic thing from the outside peering in, you know, it's a sum that Chelsea have to agree to pay. Once they've done it, that's it. I don't believe that to be the case at all. I think there will be certain aspects to this deal that have been ironed out over the last couple of weeks, hence the period of time that we've had to wait for this story to truly break, with the likes of David Ornstein and Fabrizio Romano reporting it, to suggest that, you know, there may well be a shifting of the sands in terms of the percentage up front that we are getting. And of course, if we do manage to get, say, £30 million of that up front from Chelsea, then it does mean we have more fluidity in the market to go forward and secure those transfers that are potentially a level up from the Damari Grays and the Callum Hudson-Odois. That may well be me putting 2 and 2 together and getting 5, but I don't envisage a scenario where Crystal Palace now rest on their laurels and go into this final 2 weeks of the summer transfer window without making at least 4 if not 5 additions to the first team squad. We need a new left back to cover in terms of Tyreek Mitchell and having backup there. There has been conversations about Lewis Hall and a potential season-long loan move from Chelsea. They seem to have stalled in the last week or so, with Newcastle appearing on the scene as a potential destination for the teenager. But alongside backup at left back, we already needed more depth on the wings. I think that is only going to become a more pressing thing now that Michael Olise is leaving, and we are also in the market for a striker. Not to mention the fact that Vicente Gaeta is refusing to play, so you would assume a backup goalkeeper will also be on his way to SE25 across the next couple of weeks. So a very, very busy 2-week period, I suppose you could say, for Crystal Palace in the transfer market. It hasn't been a particularly pleasant time for us. You know, the Wilfried Zaha contract saga was one which looked as though it was coming towards our favour towards the end, only for Galatasaray to make their presence known and for that deal to come about very quickly. We have now lost Michael Olise in the same summer, and Crystal Palace fans are reeling for all the right reasons, really. But from my perspective, and I've said this morning on the Palace podcast, I try as an individual to zoom out as best as I can and look at the picture in the overall. And I feel as though if we have not spent upwards of 30 million, maybe even 40 million by the time this summer transfer window comes to a close, then Crystal Palace fans will be well within their rights to question the direction of the football club. But for the moment, we have to trust in the hierarchy to try and get those deals sorted and make sure that we are in as good a place as possible following the loss of the likes of Zaha and Olise over the same summer. It's a pretty difficult thing to contemplate, because of course when Patrick Vieira first arrived it felt as though the club were on this real upward trajectory, and instead, you know, he has now left, Roy Hodgson has come back, and we have lost 2 key players as part of our system. But a football club is an ever evolving organism, and with that in mind, we have to hope that the club can get their ducks in a row and make sure they make some pretty solid incoming transfers across the next week or two. Other than that, that's pretty much the overall picture when it comes to the Michael Olise situation from my perspective as a Palace fan. Of course, I'm not suggesting that people outside of a Chelsea or Palace bubble might be interested in this, but with that release clause, there were plenty of people asking me why Crystal Palace had inserted it in the first place. The long and short answer to it has been described in this video, but to break it down to a single sentence, had we not inserted that release clause in the first place, we wouldn't have had Michael Olise at Selhurst Park at all across the last couple of years. So it's a necessary evil. Other than that, I will sign off there for this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you have, please do consider giving the video a like and pushing the subscribe button, because it does massively help me. And other than that, I will speak to you again soon. Cheers.